Hello, my lovely anatomist and physiologist, Michele here. We are still thinking and talking about our ascending tracts. Ascending tracts, remember, mean carrying sensory information from the body to the brain. We're looking at these bundles of myelinated axons that are in the spinal cord. And what we're really picking up here, the thing that's important, is how the nervous system is patterned or organized in such a way. This is how we're able to really interpret the information that's coming in to the central nervous system, is because it's always traveling these same kind of pathways. All right, so we left off looking at our transverse section of our spinal cord, and we were paying attention to the white matter, which is the outside of the spinal cord. And we talked, remember, about dividing that white matter up into anterior, lateral, and posterior white columns. And we said a column, according to Michele, is a bundle of tracts. And those tracts you can think about as those fiber optic cables or highways, roadways, transmitting information. And then what we did is we went in and we color coded where these different ascending tracts would actually be located in the spinal cord. Our job now is to talk about each of these ascending tracts in more detail. And we're going to be using one of my favorite tools, which is a table, right? So as we're looking at our ascending tracts, all of these are ascending tracts. So let's maybe even make our note here. We're going to have 4 of these. So I have a table here with 5 different rows and 4 columns. And the first column is tract. And then I've labeled those rows with each one of those tracts. So I've started out with the anterior spinothalamic, lateral spinothalamic, and then I've listed it as either the dorsal column or posterior column, because there's a difference in how you might see that. And then the last I've grouped together the anterior and lateral spinocerebellar together. So we actually don't have to differentiate between those. Going across the top of our columns, we have general sensory information. So we do want to be very specific, like what exact type of sensory information is traveling. We have this word decussation, which remember is talking about crossover. That has to do with that hemispheric lateralization of the cerebrum. So remember, the left body sensory information is going to be processed in the right hemisphere. And then our processing center is our last column heading. Let's start out with that anterior spinothalamic, and we can remind ourselves that it's actually going to be located in the anterior white column of our spinal cord. And this one is transmitting sensory information of crude touch and pressure. So crude touch and pressure. We're going to have what's called crude touch and what's called fine touch. So one example as a difference would be fine touch would be the kind of detailed information that allows you maybe to read Braille, right? So we're looking at really picking out difference. We're not just saying, oh, it's bumpy. We're saying it's bumpy in this particular type of pattern, right? So crude touch would be more like, oh, it's bumpy, without getting much more detailed than that. As we look at this, what we'll see is the anterior spinothalamic information travels into the spinal cord and it will automatically decussate at the spinal cord level. So we're going to draw out a diagram, kind of giving us another visual of these pathways, but we're seeing the decussation is happening at the spinal cord level. So it comes in and it crosses over. And then we're going to see that the processing center is going to be the primary somatosensory cortex, which, remember, anatomically speaking, we can talk about this as the post-central gyrus, which, remember, is located as part of the parietal lobe. Now I'm using here my 1 degree as my shorthand abbreviation for primary. Okay, let's take a look next at the lateral spinal thalamic. And this one is going to be called lateral because it's going to be located in the lateral white column. These are all carrying sensory information. So the question is like, oh, what kind? And this is going to be carrying both pain and temperature information. Now it's easy for me to remember that pain and temperature information travels together because products like icy hot are really helping to trick the body in a way. So an icy hot is not solving the pain problem, but instead it's overwhelming the nervous system with this temperature information of ice, cold, icy coldness or hotness, right? And so because the system is overwhelmed with the temperature information, then the pain information just kind of is quiet, right? So this is like the noisy kid at the party, and all attention goes to the noisy kid, and everybody else is just kind of in the shadows, but they're still there. We're going to see with the lateral spinothalamic that we also get crossover at the spinal cord level. So the differences here between these two pathways or tracks is that they're located in different places and they carry different kind of sensory information. And we'll see the same thing here. So we'll still see processing here is happening at the primary somatosensory cortex. If you pay attention to the names of the two tracks, they're both called spinothalamic. And so what that is telling you is that they come in at the spinal cord, they make their way to the thalamus. And if we think about the job of the thalamus, then we should remember it's always going to make its way to the cerebrum then for processing. That's what the thalamus does. Okay, this next one is called the dorsal column or the posterior column track or pathway. And so this is actually located, remember, that entire posterior white column. This is so the largest track that we've dealt with so far. This has a ton of information. So I always think, okay, it's the hugest amount of white matter, so most axons, and it's carrying the most amount of information. So we have fine touch, we have vibration, we have pressure, we have proprioception. Okay. Now this one is going to come in, go ahead and travel straight up, and then the crossover is going to take place at the brainstem level. So the information comes in, immediately ascends or travels up, and then crosses over at the brainstem, and it's also going to be processed at the primary somatosensory cortex. So we're seeing a pattern where that's the primary location for processing sensory information from our body. Remember, body is talking about like skin, muscle, bone. Okay, the last ones, the anterior and the lateral spinocerebellar, these do have some important differences, but we're not expected to really get into that level of detail. Now, they're named anterior and lateral because they're located, remember, in both the anterior and the lateral white columns. This is carrying sensory information, and it's called spinocerebellar because it's coming in at the spinal cord, but it's being processed at the cerebellum. So I'm going to go ahead and write that in because this is something that's different. We haven't seen this yet. Cerebellum, remember, is that location where we're doing grace, right? This is where we're smoothing out our muscle movements. We're kind of maintaining posture, as well as we talked about it having some other jobs in terms of kind of like how we relate out in the world, right? How we process information and relate out in the world. When we're talking about this sensory pathway, I think here what we should focus in on is proprioception. And this is an easy one for me to remember because, again, proprioception is talking about the position of the body in space. And so if the cerebellum is going to give us these graceful movements, it has to know how our body is positioned in space, right? And then what we'll see is that the decussation is happening at both places. So some information comes in, travels straight up, and then crosses over at the brain stem. And then other information comes in, crosses at the spinal cord, and then makes its way up to the cerebellum for processing. And so that's a difference between the anterior and lateral spinocerebellar tracts, but that is information that we don't have to focus in on. Okay, so next up, I'd like to do a video kind of drawing out these different tracks to give us another sort of visualization. So we've seen this in our cross section of our spinal cord. We've mapped out on a table the important details, and then I'd like to actually give you some visuals for these pathways. So stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.